Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Ulysses S. Grant, Part 4, Unconditional Surrender Grant. We stopped last time in 1862. General Ulysses S. Grant had led Union forces to a spectacular victory at Fort Henry, Tennessee, and the Union flag was reestablished in that state. Fort Henry, the victory at Fort Henry, was a tonic for President Abraham Lincoln's flagging spirits, and Grant was ready to take Fort Donelson, the twin fort, not too far away. He wanted to keep the ball moving, keep the momentum going. However, General Halleck did not approve of an attack on Fort Donelson. In fact, he disapproved of that. Grant knew that taking Fort Donelson would be more difficult. It had a high elevation, miles of trenches, and 17,000 well-equipped men with arms and provisions. Fort Donelson would not be as easy as Fort Henry. Again, the high elevation and all those troops, surrounded by streams, gullies, ravines. It seemed impregnable. There were days of rain after the fall of Fort Henry, and muddy roads slowed the wagons and artillery. The gunboats traveled 150 miles. Infantry 12 miles, and Grant was scouting the terrain himself. In the Fort Henry battle plan, the infantry, there was infantry firing and gunboats firing. February 12th, Grant and 15,000 troops set out for Fort Donelson, and General Halleck was upset. He wanted Grant to strengthen Fort Henry as a base. February 13th, the temperature dropped and it was snowing, and the men regretted discarding their coats and blankets when it had been warm. One of the generals at Fort Donelson was Nathan Bedford Forrest. So the Battle of Fort Donelson was coming and started. Union fleet was battered by Fort Donelson and drifted back down the river after 90 minutes of conflict, and the Confederate soldiers cheered. The telegram sent the news of victory for the Confederates to Richmond, Virginia. Now, the Fort Henry gunboats had achieved victory at Fort Donelson. But at Fort Donelson, the Army was needed. They needed to build trenches, and they needed to have a land and artillery siege. 3 Confederate generals were in the battle. John B. Floyd, who'd been Secretary of War for President James Buchanan. Next morning, the Confederates attacked, and they hoped to escape to safety in Nashville. The Battle of Fort Donelson, Ulysses S. Grant said, quote, "Let's get away from this dreadful place. I suppose this work is part of the devil that is left in us all." And he quoted Robert Burns, the poet, quote, "Man's inhumanity to man makes countless thousands mourn." So at the Battle of Fort Donelson, early on, the Union retreated. Ulysses S. Grant was composed and wanted to retake his position. He understood the mentality of defeat. After the early fighting, both sides were tired. The gunboats continued firing on Fort Donelson, and Grant's strategy was the enemy must not be allowed to escape. He knew that the Confederates were disoriented and vulnerable, and therefore the Union should attack. The Confederates returned to Fort Donelson from their forward positions, and Grant was sick of the carnage that he was witnessing. And Grant's aggression was exactly what President Abraham Lincoln wanted. And then, finally, the Confederates did surrender. February 16th, they sent a flag of truce, and the white flag. Confederates wanted to negotiate terms of surrender. Grant's answer was unconditional surrender. This is how he got his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant met with Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner at the Dover Hotel. Grant and Buckner were old friends. The Confederates allowed the Confederate General Gideon Pillow did escape. Grant was glad because he believed that General Pillow would do the Union good as a commander for the Confederates because he was such a poor general. He once dug a ditch on the wrong side of breastworks, and once was reportedly cut down by grape shot when a bullet grazed his foot. So, victory at Fort Donelson. There were 13,000 prisoners, a North American record. Grant again was merciful. He gave food to the prisoners, he allowed them to keep their sidearms. There was no ceremony of stacking of arms, which would be humiliating. Grant said, quote, "Why should we go through with vain forms and mortify and injure the spirit of brave men, who after all are our own countrymen?" Grant followed the new national policy of not returning escaped slaves to their masters. Fort Donelson. Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner, who surrendered to Grant. 8 years earlier, Buckner paid Grant's bill in New York City after he'd gotten out of the Army. Grant got out of the Army and had no money. And during the negotiations, Grant demanded unconditional surrender, got his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Buckner did submit, but called the terms ungenerous and unchivalrous. Fort Donelson, 200 slaves came. Grant considered them contraband and gave them work, cooking, handling horses, and other jobs. And Grant said, quote, "We want laborers. Let the Negroes work for us." Grant understood the historic nature of Fort Donelson. The victory raised morale in the North. This was a major victory in the North. There was celebration in Illinois and throughout the North. This was the first major Union victory, and Grant became famous, and his nickname, Unconditional Surrender Grant. Grant was seen as a fighting soldier. He was seen as bashful, humble. There were reports that Grant was smoking a cigar during the Battle of Fort Donelson, and there was a photograph of him. And the public, as a result, sent him 10,000 cigars. This ultimately became tragic. He developed the habit of smoking 18 to 20 cigars a day for almost the rest of his life, and became a fatal addiction. After Fort Donelson, Grant was promoted to Major General. President Lincoln and General Grant developed a special affinity. Grant proved himself. He no longer had to please his father and father-in-law. The conquests of Forts Henry and Donelson carved huge chunks from the Confederate territory. The North had command of Kentucky and west central Tennessee and part of the Mississippi Valley. Over in Europe, the father of communism, Karl Marx, watched this and was impressed. Grant proceeded east on the Cumberland River and took the town of Clarksville. The black people there cheered. The whites were gone. There was a plan to take Nashville, Tennessee, the state capital, and on February 27th, Grant and Union forces were in Nashville. And after that, Andrew Johnson became the new military governor of Tennessee. Ulysses S. Grant had an enemy in Union General Buell. Of course, these guys all were competing, and this rivalry could be very destructive. General Halleck also disliked Grant, probably jealous, and he worked to undermine him. Very sad. Halleck wrote to McClellan that Grant was an alcoholic, and after this tremendous victory, General George McClellan decided to arrest Grant. Halleck and all these guys were jealous of Grant, Buell, Halleck, and McClellan. They'd been upstaged by him and determined to knock him down. Halleck ordered Grant to stay at Fort Henry, and he lost his command. This was a discouraging time for Ulysses S. Grant. Now, General William Tecumseh Sherman was his old friend, and Sherman came in handy at this time because you need friends when life is tough. Sherman loved William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. He was named after the Shawnee chief Tecumseh. Sherman had married the daughter of U.S. Senator Thomas Ewing. At his wedding, those who attended included Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, and Zachary Taylor. In 1859, Sherman was the head of the military college in Louisiana, and he cried when the South seceded. He was considered insane at one time. Of course, they both had depression, and then Grant and Sherman had become very good friends. Sherman said this about Ulysses S. Grant, quote, "He is a strange character. Nothing like it is portrayed by Plutarch or the many who have striven to portray the great men of ancient or modern times. He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now, sir, we stand by each other always." Sherman's encouragement, friends encourage each other, and this was a time when Grant needed encouragement. They both had a bold fighting spirit, Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman said, quote, "Grant is the greatest soldier of our time, if not all time." And Grant said that Sherman is not only a great soldier, but a great man. Now, during this time, President Lincoln, who knew what was going on, he supported Grant. And so actually that was critical. If not for that, Grant's career would have been over. And he knew he needed Grant. He could see he was a fighting general. And Grant was returned, given his command back with encouragement from William Tecumseh Sherman and the support of President Lincoln. His next goal was to take Corinth in northern Mississippi, crossroads of two railroads that connected the Mississippi with the Atlantic Ocean. Northeastern Mississippi Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston had 50,000 to 60,000 troops. Halleck merged Grant and Buell's armies to fight Johnston. Grant started from Pittsburgh Landing, 20 miles from Corinth, near the Methodist meeting house of Shiloh. Shiloh was a place of Jewish worship before the first temple in the Old Testament of the Bible. Grant was not inclined to dig trenches. He wanted to move, and he was aggressive. Grant hoped that another battle would be a decisive blow and help end the rebellion. Confederate General Pierre G.T. Beauregard was involved in the looming Battle of Shiloh, Tennessee. Grant's army faced a juggernaut. Grant's horse. Now, at this time, Grant was riding his horse and had an accident, and an ankle. The horse fell, and his ankle was injured. At the Battle of Shiloh, Grant was charged with that he was blindsided. On April 15th, Grant was not aware of a massive attack of 40,000 Confederate troops coming at Shiloh. Confederate generals there were Johnston and Beauregard. Johnston inspired his men with high-flown rhetoric. Beauregard admired Napoleon Bonaparte and was the hero of the Battle of Bull Run. On April 6th, the Confederates attacked in the woods near the Shiloh church. General William Tecumseh Sherman was involved. The Union retreated. The Confederates stopped to plunder the Union camps, and they lost their advantage. At Pittsburgh Landing, General Grant arrived and took charge with his energy. There were thousands of Union troops who were fearful and wounded at Pittsburgh Landing, and Grant rallied them. He attempted to restore order. There was an onslaught of panic-stricken men who were inexperienced. Shiloh became the Civil War's bloodiest battle so far. Grant rode all over the battlefield, rallying troops with his coolness and calmness. General Sherman was caked in dust. He had a bloody arm in a bandage and an arm sling where a bullet went through his shoulder. He was indestructible. Death and slaughter solidified the friendship of Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. At Shiloh restored Sherman's reputation because he did very well there. Helped him overcome the earlier charges of insanity. Union General Lew Wallace had a poor performance at Shiloh. He marched his army on a long march around and arrived after the battle was over. Couldn't help. For years, Wallace sent letters to Grant trying to convince him that he acted honorably. Grant's reaction was that Wallace was a typical well-connected general, a political general. Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston was struck by a bullet near his right knee. He refused to leave his men and bled to death. He was the highest-ranking general killed in the war so far. On Shiloh, the first day, the Confederates won big. However, General Grant remained confident. He knew the Confederates were tired, and he believed that the Union forces would succeed on a second day of fighting, and this did happen. Grant's ability to remain confident during hardships was crucial in winning the Civil War. He said, quote, "They can't break our lines tonight. Tomorrow we shall attack with fresh troops, and of course we'll drive them." Grant did not crumble in adversity. He was hardened by it and more determined. This was a dangerous situation, and it brought out Ulysses S. Grant's indomitable will. On the first day of Shiloh, there were 7,000 Union soldiers killed or wounded and 3,000 prisoners. On the first night, there were 2,000 corpses on the battlefield in a 12-square-mile area. A nightmarish scene as thousands of wounded men were moaning in a strong rain on the bloody ground. There were torn limbs and decapitated heads. Wild pigs were eating dead bodies, and their snorts were audible to the dying soldiers. Union gunboats on the Tennessee River had unleashed artillery fire on Confederate positions. That first night, many soldiers died of exposure, sleeping in puddles in the wet and cold. Ulysses S. Grant's ankle injury put him on crutches. It was impossible for him to sleep because of the pain, rain, and cold. There was a log house hospital with many amputations taking place, stacks of arms and legs inside, using whiskey as anesthesia. Grant went into the house for shelter, but left, seeing this sight of horror, which was unendurable for him, and he returned to a tree in the rain. Grant could endure the horrors of battle, but not the horrors of men with amputated limbs. After the first day of the battle at night, General Sherman came and believed the Union troops needed to retreat, that they had been defeated. But he wasn't quite sure of Grant's reaction, and so he said, quote, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" This is when Grant was under that tree in the rain at night. And Grant's famous reaction, immortal words were, quote, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And this inspired Sherman, that he could tell that Grant was not discouraged, that he was ready not to retreat, but to attack the second day and defeat the Confederates at Shiloh. He was strong. He knew both sides were defeated from the first day of battle, and the second day that they could win the Battle of Shiloh. Grant gave his division commanders freedom of spontaneous action during battles. On the second day of Shiloh, in the morning, the Union troops attacked, and the Confederates were surprised and retreated. At 2:30 p.m., Confederate General Beauregard ordered a total retreat and for the Confederates to return to their base in Corinth, Mississippi. The carnage at Shiloh was stunning. It was a new benchmark in mass slaughter, the war's bloodiest battle so far. 100,000 soldiers, 24,000 killed or wounded. On the open field, it was possible to walk the whole area and step on dead bodies. There were more casualties at Shiloh than the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. The romance of war was gone. This was the destructive power of modern combat. A mini-ball could rip through flesh and bone. Rifled musket had accuracy and range. There was a demonic spirit of destruction in the military technology. Many more bloodbaths would come in this war of attrition, the United States Civil War. For Grant, Shiloh was a personal victory because he turned defeat into victory. Historian Charles Bracelin Flood wrote, quote, "Shiloh was a great victory in itself, but that meeting in the rain symbolized something more. Enormous military and political results flowed from the friendship between Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, two men who had been obscure failures before the Civil War." Sherman said about Grant and himself, quote, "We were as brothers." At Shiloh, Confederate General Beauregard's staff, one of the staff members, said to Beauregard, quote, "General, do you not think our troops are very much in the condition of lump sugar, thoroughly soaked with water, but yet preserving its original shape, though ready to dissolve?" And Charles Bracelin Flood wrote, quote, "Beauregard, who was in all probability not thinking of his suffering army as a lump of sugar, replied, 'I intend to withdraw in a few minutes.'" Grant said about the Battle of Shiloh, quote, Up to the Battle of Shiloh, I, as well as thousands of other citizens, believed that the rebellion against the government would collapse suddenly and soon if a decisive victory could be gained over any of its armies. Then indeed I gave up all idea of saving the Union except by complete conquest. There was a national debate on the meaning of the Battle of Shiloh because there was so much death and destruction. The dead were buried in anonymous mass graves. There were wagons of burial details that ran over skulls. There were toes protruding from the earth. After Shiloh, Grant was vilified in the press, and he was shocked. The northern press called Shiloh a defeat because of all the death and wounded men. Grant had never received such national condemnation, and he was traumatized by it. He shut down Confederate newspapers in areas of the South which he conquered. The press said that Grant was caught off guard by the Confederate attack and failed to chase Beauregard back to Corinth. He was portrayed as inept and insensitive to mass slaughter. Iowa Senator James Harlan led a chorus demanding the removal of Grant on behalf of, quote, slaughtered countrymen. Whitelaw Reid wrote in the Cincinnati Gazette that a 19,500-word account of Shiloh and blamed Grant for the death and destruction. He accused Grant of being drunk at Shiloh. This was not true. William Tecumseh Sherman wrote a letter to Grant at this time, quote, "There is a power in our land, irresponsible, corrupt, and malicious, the press, which has created the intense feeling of hostility that have arrayed the two parts of our country against each other, which must be curbed and brought within the limits of reason and law before we can have peace in America." Yeah, we talk a lot about freedom of the press, but the press can really be problematic because they can create a conflict, which is exactly what he wrote, and that seems to be going on today as well. President Lincoln lost confidence in General George McClellan during this time. He supported and saved Grant again. For Lincoln, Grant was brave and competent and willing to battle. Lincoln and Grant's partnership was needed to win the Civil War. President Lincoln faced strong pressure to remove General Grant, but he was firm in keeping him in power, and Lincoln said, quote, "I can't spare this man. He fights." For Grant, Shiloh was a victory with heavy loss. Grant was not prepared for the criticism after Shiloh. His father, mother, wife, and children were all upset by the condemnation of Ulysses S. Grant after Shiloh, and this hurt him as well. His father, Jesse, wrote a letter to the Cincinnati Commercial newspaper blaming, quote, 5,000 cowards for Shiloh. Grant was upset with this letter by his father and lectured his father that did not help. On April 11th, Grant was in a cloud of controversy. General Henry Halleck arrived at Pittsburgh Landing to take command of the army there. Grant was in limbo again. Halleck was a bureaucrat and Grant a warrior. Halleck scolded Grant. Late in April, Halleck led 110,000 soldiers marching south toward Corinth, Mississippi. Generals George Thomas, Buell, and Pope were all involved. Halleck had his men dig trenches every night because he was afraid of a Confederate attack. Ulysses S. Grant in the South could see the poverty being created from the war, and in a letter to his dear wife Julia wrote, quote, "I pity them and regret their folly, which has brought about this unnatural war and their suffering." Grant was bitter in his loss of command again. On May 11th, Grant wrote a letter to General Halleck requesting that his command be restored or he be relieved from duty. However, he did not send the letter because General Sherman interceded and asked him to be patient and wait to regain the favor of Halleck. Sherman urged Grant to wait 2 weeks and withhold his resignation, and Grant agreed. Sherman said that Grant taking his advice was a turning point in the war, near loss of Grant in the war. On May 28th, General Halleck and his huge army was 1 mile from Corinth, Mississippi. Grant advised attack, but Halleck rejected that. On May 29th and 30th, the Confederate Army, with sick soldiers and amputees from Shiloh, and General Beauregard withdrew before the Union Army could attack. Halleck captured Corinth in what he called a brilliant victory. However, it was not captured. It had been abandoned. In Corinth, there were burning houses, shattered windows, and rotting food that had been dumped in the streets. Grant was sympathetic to the suffering of the local people in Corinth, the women and children. There was a bloodless fall of Corinth, and Grant said that we could win the war by defeating armies, not taking towns. Grant believed it was better to strike in a timely fashion with a smaller force than wait for reinforcements. Again, there was strong pressure on Lincoln to remove Grant. However, Lincoln continued to support him. On June 6, General Halleck returned to St. Louis, Missouri, and restored Grant to his old command. Grant moved his headquarters to Memphis, Tennessee. New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Memphis were now in Union hands. Vicksburg, Mississippi was the major fortress, blocking Union domination of the Mississippi River. On June 23rd, General Grant entered Memphis, Tennessee, dusty and tired. The people there had strong support for the Confederacy. However, Grant was patient with them. It was a challenging situation. Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was raiding in northern Alabama and middle Tennessee. Grant cracked down on guerrilla activity. He punished people who supported it by confiscating their property. On July 11th, Henry Halleck summoned Grant to Corinth, Mississippi. Trade between the North and South in cotton, trading with the enemy. Grant tried to stop it. He was vetoed by the administration. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said that the payment of gold should not be prohibited. He wanted to get as much cotton to market as possible. So even though it helped the Confederacy, the North wanted that cotton for use. And Grant said that Union troops did not like to protect the cotton trade, supporting the enemy and businessmen and the profit of businessmen. Corinth became Grant's new headquarters. President Lincoln was tired of General George McClellan. Halleck became Lincoln's military advisor and general-in-chief. Lincoln learned that Halleck was similar to McClellan. Halleck was summoned by President Lincoln to Washington, D.C. In West, the Army was under General Grant and Buell. On July 16th, Halleck said to Grant that he was being given command of western Tennessee, the Mississippi River, Ohio, and Ohio and Tennessee River's boundary. Grant still respected Halleck during this time. Halleck was breaking up the huge army. Grant's army was in a sea of a hostile population. The public focus of the war was on Virginia, not in the West. On August 2, 1862, was the Second Battle of Bull Run, Manassas Junction, Virginia. Confederate generals were Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. It was a Confederate victory. Union general was John Pope, who had a big ego and became depressed after the defeat. President Lincoln was experiencing severe depression himself. Lincoln restored McClellan to command in Virginia. Halleck's career went into decline after the defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run. General Halleck had hemorrhoids. He used opium to dull the pain. He would collapse under pressure. There was a drought in the northern Mississippi. Grant was in Corinth, Mississippi. He had defensive operations, small skirmishes. He was defending railroads, telegraph wire, and the rivers. Grant could see that the Confederates were strong. There was strong civilian support for the Confederacy and broadening the war. Grant protected local residents from rough handling by his soldiers. Grant once saw a straggler assault a woman, and Grant jumped off his horse, seized the musket of the soldier, and hit him on the head with the musket, knocking him to the ground. Grant accepted that the war would last a long time. He might not go home till the end of the war, so he had Julia and the children come to him at Corinth, Mississippi. Escaped slaves were seeking asylum with Grant's army. Congress passed a law preventing the return of slaves. In July, the Militia Act was passed where free slaves could serve in the militia. The Union armies in the South became agents of liberation. In July, President Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Blacks were working for the Union cause. Grant supported the use of blacks in the Union Army. On August 11th, Grant gave an order that no escaped slaves were to be returned to their owners. They were to be employed as teamsters, cooks, hospital attendants, and nurses. The slaves were ragged, ill-clad, and frightened. Grant issued an order giving them shoes, pants, and tobacco. Grant had 50,000 men covering a huge territory. Grant postponed offensive operations. By September, Grant could see that the two Confederate generals and their armies were in the area. Sterling Price, with 15,000 men, seized Iuka, a supply depot and railroad junction near Corinth in northeastern Mississippi. Confederate General Earl Van Dorn was also there. Grant feared that he would be attacked by these two armies, and Grant decided to attack Iuka. He was very tired during this time. Grant was getting 5 hours of sleep a night. Some nights he did not sleep at all. The Battle of Iuka took place on September 19th, 2 days. The first day, the Confederates won. The second day, Grant took Iuka. Union General William Rosecrans was part of that battle. Rosecrans was involved in newspapers that were anti-Grant. October 3rd, the Confederates attacked Grant's army at Corinth. This was a Union victory. 2,500 Union dead, however. 5,000 Union dead. Rosecrans was heroic in this battle. But however, he did not pursue the retreating Confederates, and this was an error on his part. Grant became progressively disillusioned with Rosecrans. There were Union victories on the northern Mississippi. These were a smashing blow to the Confederacy. Grant did not have enough men for an offensive. He coveted the big prize of Vicksburg, Mississippi. In the south, losing Iuka and Corinth, much was lost. General Van Dorn was blamed. Grant's star was rising again. On October 16th, he was appointed command of the Department of Tennessee, Jackson, Tennessee, Western Kentucky, Tennessee, Northern Mississippi, and Southern Illinois. Grant wanted more troops. He was thinking about Vicksburg and Grand Junction going south, the Mississippi Railroad. Some Union soldiers were looting, and this upset Grant. There were camp followers who were stealing horses, mules, and vehicles and robbing houses. Grant fought this. Such acts were punishable by death. Grant was pushing south on the Mississippi River Railroad. He had a dangerously long supply line. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Next time we'll continue with Part 5 of the fascinating life of Ulysses S. Grant. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.